Book One, Chapter 9 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Katie Gibney, Arkansas, December 2007. My Antonia by Willa Cather, Book One, The Shimerdas, Chapter 9. The first snowfall came early in December. I remember how the world looked from our sitting room window as I dressed behind the stove that morning. The low sky was like a sheet of metal. The blond cornfields had faded out into ghostliness at last. The little pond was frozen under its stiff willow bushes. Big white flakes were whirling over everything and disappearing in the red grass. Beyond the pond, on the slope that climbed to the cornfield, there was, faintly marked in the grass, a great circle where the Indians used to ride. Jake and Otto were sure that when they galloped round that ring the Indians tortured prisoners, bound to a stake in the center. But grandfather thought they merely ran races or trained horses there. Whenever one looked at this slope against the setting sun, the circle showed like a pattern in the grass, and this morning, when the first light spray of snow lay over it, it came out with wonderful distinctness, like strokes of Chinese white on canvas. The old figure stirred in me as it had never done before, and seemed a good omen for the winter. As soon as the snow had packed hard, I began to drive about the country in a clumsy sleigh that Otto Fuchs made for me by fastening a wooden goods box on bobs. Fuchs had been apprenticed to a cabinet maker in the old country, and was very handy with tools. He would have done a better job if I hadn't hurried him. My first trip was to the post office, and the next day I went over to take Yulka and Antonia for a sleigh ride. It was a bright cold day. I piled straw and buffalo robes into the box, and took 2 hot bricks wrapped in old blankets. When I got to the Shimerdas I did not go up to the house, but sat in my sleigh at the bottom of the draw and called. Antonia and Yulka came running out, wearing little rabbit-skin hats their father had made for them. They had heard about my sledge from Ambrosch, and knew why I had come. They tumbled in beside me, and we set off toward the north, along a road that happened to be broken. The sky was brilliantly blue, and the sunlight on the glittering white stretches of prairie was almost blinding. As Antonia said, the whole world was changed by the snow. We kept looking in vain for familiar landmarks. The deep arroyo through which Squaw Creek wound was now only a cleft between snowdrifts, very blue when one looked down into it. The treetops that had been gold all the autumn were dwarfed and twisted, as if they would never have any life in them again. The few little cedars, which were so dull and dingy before, now stood out a strong dusky green. The wind had the burning taste of fresh snow. My throat and nostrils smarted as if some one had opened a hartshorn bottle. The cold stung, and at the same time delighted one. My horse's breath rose like steam, and whenever we stopped he smoked all over. The cornfields got back a little of their color under the dazzling light, and stood the palest possible gold in the sun and snow. All about us the snow was crusted in shallow terraces, with tracings like ripple marks at the edges, curly waves that were the actual impression of the stinging lash in the wind. The girls had on cotton dresses under their shawls. They kept shivering beneath the buffalo robes and hugging each other for warmth. But they were so glad to get away from their ugly cave and their mother's scolding that they begged me to go on and on, as far as Russian Peter's house. The great fresh open, after the stupefying warmth indoors, made them behave like wild things. They laughed and shouted, and said they never wanted to go home again. Couldn't we settle down and live in Russian Peter's house, Yulka asked, and couldn't I go to town and buy things for us to keep house with? All the way to Russian Peter's we were extravagantly happy, but when we turned back, it must have been about 4 o'clock, the east wind grew stronger and began to howl, the sun lost its heartening power, and the sky became gray and somber. I took off my long woolen comforter and wound it around Yulka's throat. She got so cold that we made her hide her head under the buffalo robe. Antonia and I sat erect, but I held the reins clumsily, and my eyes were blinded by the wind a good deal of the time. It was growing dark when we got to their house, but I refused to go in with them and get warm. I knew my hands would ache terribly if I went near a fire. Yulka forgot to give me back my comforter, and I had to drive home directly against the wind. The next day I came down with an attack of quinsy, which kept me in the house for nearly 2 weeks. The basement kitchen seemed heavenly safe and warm in those days, like a tight little boat in a winter sea. The men were out in the fields all day, husking corn, and when they came in at noon, with long caps pulled down over their ears, and their feet in red-lined overshoes, I used to think they were like Arctic explorers. In the afternoons, when grandmother sat upstairs darning, or making husking gloves, I read "The Swiss Family Robinson" aloud to her, and I felt that the Swiss family had no advantages over us in the way of an adventurous life. I was convinced that man's strongest antagonist is the cold. I admired the cheerful zest with which grandmother went about keeping us warm and comfortable and well fed. She often reminded me, when she was preparing for the return of the hungry men, that this country was not like Virginia, and that here a cook had, as she said, very little to do with. On Sundays she gave us as much chicken as we could eat, and on other days we had ham or bacon or sausage meat. She baked either pies or cake for us every day, unless, for a change, she made my favorite pudding, striped with currants and boiled in a bag. Next to getting warm and keeping warm, dinner and supper were the most interesting things we had to think about. Our lives centered around warmth and food and the return of the men at nightfall. I used to wonder, when they came in tired from the fields, their feet numb and their hands cracked and sore, how they could do all the chores so conscientiously: feed and water and bed the horses, milk the cows, and look after the pigs. When supper was over, it took them a long while to get the cold out of their bones. While grandmother and I washed the dishes, and grandfather read his paper upstairs, Jake and Otto sat on the long bench behind the stove, easing their inside boots, or rubbing mutton tallow into their cracked hands. Every Saturday night we popped corn or made taffy, and Otto Fuchs used to sing, "For I am a cowboy and know I've done wrong," or "Bury me not on the lone prairie." He had a good baritone voice, and always led the singing when we went to church services at the sod schoolhouse. I can still see those two men sitting on the bench, Otto's close-clipped head and Jake's shaggy hair slicked flat in front by a wet comb. I can see the sag of their tired shoulders against the whitewashed wall. What good fellows they were, how much they knew, and how many things they had kept faith with. Fuchs had been a cowboy, a stage driver, a bartender, a miner, had wandered all over that great western country and done hard work everywhere, though, as grandmother said, he had nothing to show for it. Jake was duller than Otto; he could scarcely read, wrote even his name with difficulty, and he had a violent temper which sometimes made him behave like a crazy man, tore him all to pieces and actually made him ill. But he was so soft-hearted that any one could impose upon him. If he, as he said, forgot himself and swore before grandmother, he went about depressed and shamefaced all day. They were both of them jovial about the cold in winter and the heat in summer, and always ready to work overtime and to meet emergencies. It was a matter of pride with them not to spare themselves. Yet they were the sort of men who never get on, somehow, or do anything but work hard for $1 or $2 a day. On those bitter starlit nights, as we sat around the old stove that fed us and warmed us and kept us cheerful, we could hear the coyotes howling down by the corrals, and their hungry wintry cry used to remind the boys of wonderful animal stories, about gray wolves and bears in the Rockies, wild cats and panthers in the Virginia mountains. Sometimes Fuchs could be persuaded to talk about the outlaws and desperate characters he had known. I remember one funny story about himself that made grandmother, who was working her bread on the breadboard, laugh until she wiped her eyes with her bare arm, her hands being floury. It was like this. When Otto left Austria to come to America, he was asked by one of his relatives to look after a woman who was crossing on the same boat, to join her husband in Chicago. The woman started off with 2 children, but it was clear that her family might grow larger on the journey. Fuchs said he "got on fine with the kids," and liked the mother, though she played a sorry trick on him. In mid-ocean she proceeded to have not one baby, but three. This event made Fuchs the object of undeserved notoriety, since he was traveling with her. The steerage stewardess was indignant with him, the doctor regarded him with suspicion, the first cabin passengers, who made up a purse for the woman, took an embarrassing interest in Otto and often inquired of him about his charge. When the triplets were taken ashore at New York, he had, as he said, to carry some of them. The trip to Chicago was even worse than the ocean voyage. On the train it was very difficult to get milk for the babies and to keep their bottles clean. The mother did her best, but no woman, out of her natural resources, could feed three babies. The husband, in Chicago, was working in a furniture factory for modest wages, and when he met his family at the station he was rather crushed by the size of it. He too seemed to consider Fuchs in some fashion to blame. "I was sure glad," Otto concluded, "that he didn't take his hard feelings out on that poor woman. But he had a sullen eye for me, all right. Now, did you ever hear of a young feller's having such hard luck, Mrs. Burden?" Grandmother told him she was sure the Lord had remembered these things to his credit, and had helped him out of many a scrape when he didn't realize that he was being protected by Providence. End of chapter 9.
Book 1, Chapter 10 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To find out more or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 1, The Shimerdas. Chapter 10. For several weeks after my sleigh ride we heard nothing from the Shimerdas. My sore throat kept me indoors, and grandmother had a cold which made the housework heavy for her. When Sunday came she was glad to have a day of rest. One night at supper Fuchs told us he had seen Mr. Shimerda out hunting. "He's made himself a rabbit-skin cap, Jim, and a rabbit-skin collar that he buttons on outside his coat. They ain't got but one overcoat among 'em over there, and they take turns wearing it. They seem awful scared of cold, and stick in that hole in the bank like badgers." "All but the crazy boy," Jake put in. "He never wears the coat. Krayak says he's terrible strong and can stand anything. I guess rabbits must be getting scarce in this locality. Ambrose come along by the cornfield yesterday where I was at work. It showed me 3 prairie dogs he'd shot. He asked me if they was good to eat. I spit and made a face and took on to scare him, but he just looked like he was smarter than me and put him back in his sack and walked off." Grandmother looked up in alarm and spoke to grandfather. "Josiah, you don't suppose Krayak would let the poor creatures eat prairie dogs, do you?" "You'd better go over and see our neighbors tomorrow, Emmeline," he replied gravely. Fuchs put in a cheerful word and said prairie dogs were clean beasts and ought to be good for food, but their family connections were against them. I asked what he meant, and he grinned and said they belonged to the rat family. When I went downstairs in the morning I found grandmother and Jake packing a hamper basket in the kitchen. "Now, Jake," grandmother was saying, "if you can find that old rooster that got his comb froze, just give his neck a twist and we'll take him along. There's no good reason why Mrs. Shimerda couldn't have got hens from her neighbors last fall and had a hen house going by now. I reckon she was confused and didn't know where to begin. I've come strange to a new country myself, but I never forgot hens are a good thing to have, no matter what you don't have." "Just as you say, ma'am," said Jake, "but I hate to think of Krayak getting a leg of that old rooster." He tramped out through the long cellar and dropped the heavy door behind him. After breakfast grandmother and Jake and I bundled ourselves up and climbed into the cold front wagon seat. As we approached the Shimerdas we heard the frosty whine of the pump, and saw Antonia, her head tied up and her cotton dress blown about her, throwing all her weight on the pump handle as it went up and down. She heard our wagon, looked back over her shoulder, and, catching up her pail of water, started at a run for the hole in the bank. Jake helped grandmother to the ground, saying he would bring the provisions after he had blanketed his horses. We went slowly up the icy path toward the door sunk in the draw side. Blue puffs of smoke came from the stovepipe that stuck out through the grass and snow, but the wind whisked them roughly away. Mrs. Shimerda opened the door before we knocked and seized grandmother's hand. She did not say "How do" as usual, but at once began to cry, talking very fast in her own language, pointing to her feet which were tied up in rags and looking about accusingly at everyone. The old man was sitting on a stump behind the stove, crouching over as if he were trying to hide from us. Yulka was on the floor at his feet, her kitten in her lap. She peeped out at me and smiled, but glancing up at her mother, hid again. Antonia was washing pans and dishes in a dark corner. The crazy boy lay under the only window, stretched out on a gunny sack stuffed with straw. As soon as we entered, he threw a grain sack over the crack at the bottom of the door. The air in the cave was stifling, and it was very dark, too. A lighted lantern hung over the stove threw out a feeble yellow glimmer. Mrs. Shimerda snatched off the covers of 2 barrels behind the door and made us look into them. In one there were some potatoes that had been frozen and were rotting. In the other was a little pile of flour. Grandmother murmured something in embarrassment, but the Bohemian woman laughed scornfully, a kind of whinny laugh, and catching up an empty coffee pot from the shelf, shook it at us with a look positively vindictive. Grandmother went on talking in her polite Virginia way, not admitting their stark need or her own remissness, until Jake arrived with a hamper, as if in direct answer to Mrs. Shimerda's reproaches. Then the poor woman broke down. She dropped on the floor beside her crazy son, hid her face on her knees, and sat crying bitterly. Grandmother paid no heed to her, but called Antonia to come and help empty the basket. Tony left her corner reluctantly. I had never seen her crushed like this before. "You not mind my poor mamenka, Mrs. Burden. She is so sad," she whispered, as she wiped her wet hands on her skirt and took the things Grandmother handed her. The crazy boy, seeing the food, began to make soft, gurgling noises and stroked his stomach. Jake came in again, this time with a sack of potatoes. Grandmother looked about in perplexity. "Haven't you got any sort of cave or cellar outside, Antonia? This is no place to keep vegetables. How did your potatoes get frozen?" "We get from Mr. Bushy at the post office what he throw out. We got no potatoes, Mrs. Burden," Tony admitted mournfully. When Jake went out, Marek crawled along the floor and stuffed up the door crack again. Then, quietly as a shadow, Mr. Shimerda came out from behind the stove. He stood brushing his hand over his smooth gray hair as if he were trying to clear away a fog about his head. He was clean and neat as usual, with his green neckcloth and his coral pin. He took Grandmother's arm and led her behind the stove to the back of the room. In the rear wall was another little cave, a round hole not much bigger than an oil barrel, scooped out in the black earth. When I got up on one of the stools and peered into it, I saw some quilts and a pile of straw. The old man held the lantern. "Yulka," he said in a low, despairing voice. "Yulka, my Antonia." Grandmother drew back. "You mean they sleep in there, your girls?" He bowed his head. Tony slipped under his arm. "It is very cold on the floor, and this is warm like the badger hole. I like for sleep there," she insisted eagerly. "My mamenka have nice bed with pillows from our own geese in Bohemian. See, Jim?" She pointed to the narrow bunk which Krayak had built against the wall for himself before the Shimerdas came. Grandmother sighed. "Sure enough, where would you sleep, dear? I don't doubt you're warm there. You'll have a better house after a while, Antonia, and then you will forget these hard times." Mr. Shimerda made Grandmother sit down on the only chair and pointed his wife to a stool beside her. Standing before them with his hand on Antonia's shoulder, he talked in a low tone, and his daughter translated. He wanted us to know that they were not beggars in the old country. He made good wages, and his family were respected there. He left Bohemia with more than $1,000 in savings after their passage money was paid. He had in some way lost on exchange in New York, and the railway fare to Nebraska was more than they had expected. By the time they paid Krayak for the land and bought his horses and oxen and some old farm machinery, they had very little money left. He wished Grandmother to know, however, that he still had some money. If they could get through until spring came, they would buy a cow and chickens and plant a garden, and they would then do very well. Ambrosch and Antonia were both old enough to work in the fields, and they were willing to work, but the snow and the bitter weather had disheartened them all. Antonia explained that her father meant to build a new house for them in the spring. He and Ambrosch had already split the logs for it, but the logs were all buried in the snow along the creek where they had been felled. While Grandmother encouraged and gave them advice, I sat down on the floor with Yulka and let her show me her kitten. Marek slid cautiously toward us and began to exhibit his webbed fingers. I knew he wanted to make his queer noises for me, to bark like a dog or whinny like a horse, but he did not dare in the presence of his elders. Marek was always trying to be agreeable, poor fellow, as if he had it on his mind that he must make up for his deficiencies. Mrs. Shimerda grew more calm and reasonable before our visit was over, and, while Antonia translated, put in a word now and then on her own account. The woman had a quick ear and caught up phrases whenever she heard English spoken. As we rose to go, she opened her wooden chest and brought out a bag made of bed-ticking, about as long as a flour sack and half as wide, stuffed full of something. At sight of it, the crazy boy began to smack his lips. When Mrs. Shimerda opened the bag and stirred the contents with her hand, it gave out a salty, earthy smell, very pungent even among the other odors of that cave. She measured a teacupful, tied it up in a bit of sacking, and presented it ceremoniously to grandmother. "For cook," she announced. "Little now be very much when cook," spreading out her hands as if to indicate that the pint would swell to a gallon. "Very good. You no have in this country. All things for eat better in my country." "Maybe so, Mrs. Shimerda," grandmother said dryly. "I can't say, but I prefer our bread to yours myself." Ántonia undertook to explain. "This very good, Mrs. Burden." She clasped her hands as if she could not express how good. "It make very much when you cook. Like what my mamma say. Cook with rabbit, cook with chicken, in the gravy. Oh, so good." All the way home grandmother and Jake talked about how easily good Christian people could forget they were their brother's keepers. "I will say, Jake, some of our brothers and sisters are hard to keep. Where's a body to begin with these people? They're wanting in everything, and most of all in horse sense. Nobody can give 'em that, I guess. Jimmy here is about as able to take over a homestead as they are. Do you reckon that boy Ambrose has any real push in him?" "He's a worker all right, ma'am, and he's got some catch on about him, but he's a mean one. Folks can be mean enough to get on in this world, and then again they can be too mean." That night, while grandmother was getting supper, we opened the package Mrs. Shimerda had given her. It was full of little brown chips that looked like the shavings of some root. They were as light as feathers, and the most noticeable thing about them was their penetrating earthy odor. We could not determine whether they were animal or vegetable. "They might be dried meat from some queer beast, Jim. They ain't dried fish, and they never grew on stalk or vine. I'm afraid of 'em. Anyhow, I shouldn't want to eat anything that had been shut up for months with old clothes and goose pillows." She threw the package into the stove, but I bit off a corner of one of the chips I held in my hand and chewed it tentatively. I never forgot the strange taste, though it was many years before I knew that those little brown shavings, which the Shimerdas had brought so far and treasured so jealously, were dried mushrooms. They had been gathered, probably in some deep Bohemian forest. That was Section 2, Chapter 10 of My Antonia by Willa Cather. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. To find out more or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
Book 1, Chapter 11 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wendy in Lehi, Utah. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 1, The Shimerdas, Chapter 11. During the week before Christmas, Jake was the most important person of our household, for he was to go to town and do all our Christmas shopping. But on the 21st of December the snow began to fall. The flakes came down so thickly that from the sitting-room windows I could not see beyond the windmill. Its frame looked dim and gray, unsubstantial, like a shadow. The snow did not stop falling all day or during the night that followed. The cold was not severe, but the storm was quiet and resistless. The men could not go farther than the barns and corral. They sat about the house most of the day, as if it were Sunday, greasing their boots, mending their suspenders, plaiting whiplashes. On the morning of the 22nd, Grandfather announced at breakfast that it would be impossible to go to Black Hawk for Christmas purchases. Jake was sure he could get through on horseback and bring home our things in saddlebags, but Grandfather told him the roads would be obliterated, and a newcomer in the country would be lost 10 times over. Anyway, he would never allow one of his horses to be put to such a strain. We decided to have a country Christmas without any help from town. I had wanted to get some picture books for Yulka and Antonia. Even Yulka was able to read a little now. Grandmother took me into the ice-cold storeroom, where she had some bolts of gingham and sheeting. She cut squares of cotton cloth and we sewed them together into a book. We bound it between pasteboards, which I covered with brilliant calico, representing scenes from a circus. For 2 days I sat at the dining-room table pasting this book full of pictures for Yulka. We had files of those good old family magazines which used to publish colored lithographs of popular paintings, and I was allowed to use some of these. I took Napoleon announcing the divorce to Josephine for my frontispiece. On the white pages I grouped Sunday school cards and advertising cards which I had brought from my old country. Fuchs got out the old candle molds and made tallow candles. Grandmother hunted up her fancy cake cutters and baked gingerbread men and roosters, which we decorated with burnt sugar and red cinnamon drops. On the day before Christmas, Jake packed the things we were sending to the Shimerdas in his saddlebags and set off on grandfather's gray gelding. When he mounted his horse at the door, I saw that he had a hatchet slung to his belt, and he gave grandmother a meaning look which told me he was planning a surprise for me. That afternoon I watched long and eagerly from the sitting-room window. At last I saw a dark spot moving on the west hill beside the half-buried cornfield, where the sky was taking on a coppery flush from the sun that did not quite break through. I put on my cap and ran out to meet Jake. When I got to the pond, I could see that he was bringing in a little cedar tree across his pommel. He used to help my father cut Christmas trees for me in Virginia, and he had not forgotten how much I liked them. By the time we had placed the cold, fresh-smelling little tree in a corner of the sitting-room, it was already Christmas Eve. After supper we all gathered there, and even grandfather, reading his paper by the table, looked up with friendly interest now and then. The cedar was about 5 feet high and very shapely. We hung it with gingerbread animals, strings of popcorn, and bits of candle which Fuchs had fitted into pasteboard sockets. Its real splendors, however, came from the most unlikely place in the world, from Otto's cowboy trunk. I had never seen anything in that trunk but old boots and spurs and pistols, and a fascinating mixture of yellow leather tongs, cartridges, and shoemaker's wax. From under the lining he now produced a collection of brilliantly colored paper figures, several inches high, and stiff enough to stand alone. They had been sent to him year after year by his old mother in Austria. There was a bleeding heart in tufts of paper lace. There were 3 kings gorgeously apparelled, and the ox and the ass and the shepherds. There was the baby in the manger, and a group of angels singing. There were camels and leopards held back by the black slaves of the 3 kings. Our tree became the talking tree of the fairy tale. Legends and stories nestled like birds in its branches. Grandmother said it reminded her of the tree of knowledge. We put sheets of cotton wool under it for a snow field, and Jake's pocket mirror for a frozen lake. I can see them now, exactly as they looked, working about the table in the lamplight. Jake with his heavy features so rudely molded that his face seemed somehow unfinished. Otto with his half-ear and the savage scar that made his upper lip curl so ferociously under his twisted mustache. As I remember them, what unprotected faces they were. Their very roughness and violence made them defenseless. These boys had no practiced manner behind which they could retreat and hold people at a distance. They had only their hard fists to batter at the world with. Otto was already one of those drifting, case-hardened laborers who never marry or have children of their own, yet he was so fond of children. End of Book 1, The Shimerdas, Chapter 11. Book 1, Chapter 12 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wendy in Lehi, Utah. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 1, The Shimerdas, Chapter 12. On Christmas morning, when I got down to the kitchen, the men were just coming in from their chores. The horses and pigs always had their breakfast before we did. Jake and Otto shouted "Merry Christmas" to me and winked at each other when they saw the waffle irons on the stove. Grandfather came down wearing a white shirt and his Sunday coat. Morning prayers were longer than usual. He read the chapters from St. Matthew about the birth of Christ, and as we listened it all seemed like something that had happened lately and near at hand. In his prayer he thanked the Lord for the first Christmas, and for all that it had meant to the world ever since. He gave thanks for our food and comfort, and prayed for the poor and destitute in great cities, where the struggle for life was harder than it was here with us. Grandfather's prayers were often very interesting. He had the gift of simple and moving expression. Because he talked so little, his words had a peculiar force. They were not worn dull from constant use. His prayers reflected what he was thinking about at the time, and it was chiefly through them that we got to know his feelings and his views about things. After we sat down to our waffles and sausage, Jake told us how pleased the Shimerdas had been with their presents. Even Ambrose was friendly, and went to the creek with him to cut the Christmas tree. It was a soft gray day outside, with heavy clouds working across the sky, and occasional squalls of snow. There were always odd jobs to be done about the barn on holidays, and the men were busy until afternoon. Then Jake and I played dominoes, while Otto wrote a long letter home to his mother. He always wrote to her on Christmas Day, he said, no matter where he was, and no matter how long it had been since his last letter. All afternoon he sat in the dining room. He would write for a while, then sit idle, his clenched fist lying on the table, his eyes following the pattern of the oilcloth. He spoke and wrote his own language so seldom that it came to him awkwardly. His effort to remember entirely absorbed him. At about 4 o'clock a visitor appeared. Mr. Shimerda, wearing his rabbit-skin cap and collar, and new mittens his wife had knitted. He had come to thank us for the presents, and for all grandmother's kindness to his family. Jake and Otto joined us from the basement, and we sat about the stove, enjoying the deepening gray of the winter afternoon, and the atmosphere of comfort and security in my grandfather's house. This feeling seemed completely to take possession of Mr. Shimerda. I suppose, in the crowded clutter of their cave, the old man had come to believe that peace and order had vanished from the earth, or existed only in the old world he had left so far behind. He sat still and passive, his head resting against the back of the wooden rocking-chair, his hands relaxed upon the arms. His face had a look of weariness and pleasure, like that of sick people when they feel relief from pain. Grandmother insisted on his drinking a glass of Virginia apple brandy after his long walk in the cold, and when a faint flush came up in his cheeks, his features might have been cut out of a shell, they were so transparent. He said almost nothing and smiled rarely, but as he rested there we all had a sense of his utter content. As it grew dark, I asked whether I might light the Christmas tree before the lamp was brought. When the candle ends sent up their conical yellow flames, all the colored figures from Austria stood out clear and full of meaning against the green boughs. Mr. Shimerda rose, crossed himself, and quietly knelt down before the tree, his head sunk forward. His long body formed a letter S. I saw grandmother look apprehensively at grandfather. He was rather narrow in religious matters, and sometimes spoke out and hurt people's feelings. There had been nothing strange about the tree before, but now, with someone kneeling before it, images, candles. Grandfather merely put his fingertips to his brow and bowed his venerable head, thus Protestantizing the atmosphere. We persuaded our guest to stay for supper with us. He needed a little urging. As we sat down to the table it occurred to me that he liked to look at us, and that our faces were open books to him. When his deep-seeing eyes rested on me, I felt as if he were looking far ahead into the future for me, down the road I would have to travel. At 9 o'clock Mr. Shimerda lighted one of our lanterns, and put on his overcoat and fur collar. He stood in the little entry hall, the lantern and his fur cap under his arm, shaking hands with us. When he took grandmother's hand, he bent over it as he always did and said slowly, good woman." He made the sign of the cross over me, put on his cap, and went off in the dark. As we turned back to the sitting-room, Grandfather looked at me searchingly. "The prayers of all good people are good," he said quietly. End of Book 1, The Shimerdas, Chapter 12. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, visit LibriVox.org. Book 1, Chapter 13 of my Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Wendy in Lehi, Utah. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 1, The Shimerdas, Chapter 13. The week following Christmas brought in a thaw, and by New Year's Day all the world about us was a broth of gray slush, and the guttered slope between the windmill and the barn was running black water. The soft black earth stood out in patches along the roadsides. I resumed all my chores, carried in the cobs and wood and water, and spent the afternoons at the barn, watching Jake shell corn with a hand-sheller. One morning during this interval of fine weather, Antonia and her mother rode over on one of their shaggy old horses to pay us a visit. It was the first time Mrs. Shimerda had been to our house, and she ran about, examining our carpets and curtains and furniture, all the while commenting upon them to her daughter in an envious, complaining tone. In the kitchen she caught up an iron pot that stood on the back of the stove and said, "You got many, Shimerda's no got." I thought it weak-minded of grandmother to give the pot to her. After dinner, when she was helping to wash the dishes, she said, tossing her head, "You got many things for cook. If I got all things like you, I make much better." She was a conceited, boastful old thing, and even misfortune could not humble her. I was so annoyed that I felt coldly even toward Antonia, and listened unsympathetically when she told me her father was not well. My papa sad for the old country. He not look good. He never make music any more. At home he play violin all the time, for weddings and for dance. Here, never. When I beg him for play, he shake his head no. Some days he take his violin out of his box and make with his fingers on the strings like this, but never he make the music. He don't like this country. "People who don't like this country ought to stay home," I said severely. "We don't make them come here." "He not want to come, never!" she burst out. "My mamenka made him come. All the time she say, 'America big country, much money, much land for my boys, much husband for my girls.' My papa he cry for leave his old friends what make music with him. He love very much the man what play the longhorn, like this." She indicated a slide trombone. "They go to school together and are friends from boys. But my mamma, she want Ambrose for be rich, with many cattle." "Your mamma," I said angrily, "wants other people's things." "Your grandfather is rich," she retorted fiercely. "Why he not help my papa? Ambrose be rich too after a while, and he pay back. He is a very smart boy. For Ambrose, my mamma come here." Ambrose was considered the important person in the family. Mrs. Shimerda and Antonia always deferred to him, though he was often surly with them and contemptuous toward his father. Ambrose and his mother had everything their own way. Though Antonia loved her father more than she did anyone else, she stood in awe of her elder brother. After I watched Antonia and her mother go over the hill on their miserable horse, carrying our iron pot with them, I turned to grandmother, who had taken up her darning, and said I hoped that snooping old woman wouldn't come to see us any more. Grandmother chuckled and drove her bright needle across a hole in Otto's sock. "She's not old, Jim, though I expect she seems old to you. No, I wouldn't mourn if she never came again. But you see, a body never knows what traits poverty might bring out in 'em. It makes a woman grasping to see her children want for things. Now read me a chapter in The Prince of the House of David. Let's forget the Bohemians." We had 3 weeks of this mild open weather. The cattle in the corral ate corn almost as fast as the men could shell it for them, and we hoped they would be ready for an early market. One morning the 2 big bulls, Gladstone and Brigham Young, thought spring had come. and they began to tease and butt at each other across the barbed wire that separated them. Soon they got angry. They bellowed and pawed up the soft earth with their hoofs, rolling their eyes and tossing their heads. Each withdrew to a far corner of his own corral, and then they made for each other at a gallop. Thud, thud! We could hear the impact of their great heads, and their bellowing shook the pans on the kitchen shelves. Had they not been dehorned, they would have torn each other to pieces. Pretty soon the fat steers took it up and began butting and horning each other. Clearly the affair had to be stopped. We all stood by and watched admiringly as Fuchs rode into the corral with the pitchfork and prodded the bulls again and again, finally driving them apart. The big storm of the winter began on my 11th birthday, the 20th of January. When I went down to breakfast that morning, Jake and Otto came in white as snowmen, beating their hands and stamping their feet. They began to laugh boisterously when they saw me, calling, "You've got a birthday present this time, Jim, and no mistake. They was a full-grown blizzard ordered for you." All day the storm went on. The snow did not fall this time. It simply spilled out of heaven like thousands of feather beds being emptied. The afternoon kitchen was a carpenter shop. The men brought in their tools and made 2 great wooden shovels with long handles. Neither grandmother nor I could go out in the storm, so Jake fed the chickens and brought in a pitiful contribution of eggs. Next day our men had to shovel until noon to reach the barn, and the snow was still falling. There had not been such a storm in the 10 years my grandfather had lived in Nebraska. He said at dinner that we would not try to reach the cattle. They were fat enough to go without their corn for a day or 2. But tomorrow we must feed them and thaw out their water tap so they could drink. We could not so much as see the corrals, but we knew the steers were over there, huddled together under the north bank. Our ferocious bulls, subdued enough by this time, were probably warming each other's backs. "This'll take the bile out of 'em," Fuchs remarked gleefully. At noon that day the hens had not been heard from. After dinner, Jake and Otto, their damp clothes now dried on them, stretched their stiff arms and plunged again into the drifts. They made a tunnel under the snow to the henhouse with walls so solid that grandmother and I could walk back and forth in it. We found the chickens asleep. Perhaps they thought night had come to stay. One old rooster was stirring about, pecking at the solid lump of ice in their water tin. When we flashed the lantern in their eyes, the hens set up a great cackling and flew about clumsily, scattering down feathers. The mottled, pin-headed guinea hens, always resentful of captivity, ran screeching out into the tunnel and poked their ugly painted faces through the snow walls. By 5 o'clock the chores were done, just when it was time to begin them all over again. That was a strange, unnatural sort of day. End of Chapter 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
Chapter 14 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 1, Chapter 14. The Shimerdas. On the morning of the 22nd, I wakened with a start. Before I opened my eyes, I seemed to know that something had happened. I heard excited voices in the kitchen. Grandmother's was so shrill that I knew she must be almost beside herself. I looked forward to any new crisis with delight. What could it be, I wondered, as I hurried into my clothes? Perhaps the barn had burned. Perhaps the cattle had frozen to death. Perhaps a neighbor was lost in the storm. Down in the kitchen, Grandfather was standing before the stove with his hands behind him. Jake and Otto had taken off their boots and were rubbing their woolen socks. Their clothes and boots were steaming, and they both looked exhausted. On the bench behind the stove lay a man, covered up with a blanket. Grandmother motioned me to the dining room. I obeyed reluctantly. I watched as she came in, went, carrying dishes. Her lips were tightly compressed, and she kept whispering to herself, "Oh, dear Saviour, Lord, thou knowest." Presently Grandfather came in and spoke to me. "Jimmy, we will not have prayers this morning because we have a great deal to do. Old Mr. Shimerda is dead. and his family are in great distress. Ambrosch came over here in the middle of the night, and Jake and Otto went back with him. The boys have had a hard night, and you must not bother them with questions. That is Ambrosch asleep on the bench. Come in to breakfast, boys." After Jake and Otto had swallowed their first cup of coffee, they began to talk excitedly, disregarding grandmother's warning glances. I held my tongue, but I listened with all my ears. "No, sir," Fuchs said in answer to a question from grandfather. "Nobody heard the gun go off. Ambrosch was out with the oxen team trying to break a road, and the women folks was shut up tight in their cave. When Ambrosch came in, it was dark and he didn't see nothing, but the oxen acted kind of queer. One of 'em ripped around and got away from him, bolted clean out of the stable. His hands is blistered where the rope run through. He got a lantern and went back and found the old man, just as we seen him." Poor soul," grandmother groaned. "I'd like to think he never done it. He was always considerate and unwishful to give trouble. How could he forget himself and bring this on us?" "I don't think he was out of his head for a minute, Mrs. Burden," Fuchs declared. "He done everything natural. You know he was always sort of fixy, and fixy he was to the last. He shaved after dinner, and washed hisself all over after the girls was done the dishes. Ántonia heated the water for him. Then he put on a clean shirt and clean socks, and after he was dressed he kissed her and the little one, and took his gun and said he was going out to hunt rabbits. He must have gone right down to the barn and done it then. He laid down on that bunk bed close to the ox stalls where he always slept. When we found him, everything was decent except—" Fuchs wrinkled his brow and hesitated. "Except what he couldn't nowise foresee. His coat was hung on a peg, and his boots was under the bed. He'd took off that silk neckcloth he always wore, and folded it smooth and stuck his pin through it. He turned back his shirt at the neck and rolled up his sleeves." "I don't see how he could do it," grandmother kept saying. Otto misunderstood her. "Why, ma'am, it was simple enough. He pulled the trigger with his big toe. He laid over on his side and put the end of the barrel in his mouth. Then he drew up one foot and felt for the trigger. He found it all right." "Maybe he did," said Jake grimly. "There's something mighty queer about it." "Now what do you mean, Jake?" grandmother asked sharply. "Well, ma'am, I found Cratchit's axe under the manger, and I picks it up and carries it over to the corpse, and I take my oath it just fit the gash in the front of the old man's face. That there Cratchit had been sneaking around, pale and quiet, and when he seen me examining the axe he begun whimpering. 'My God, man, don't do that. I reckon I'm a-going to look into this,' says I. Then he begun to squeal like a rat, and run around wringing his hands. 'They'll hang me,' says he. 'My God, they'll hang me sure.'" Fuchs spoke up impatiently. "Cratchit's gone silly, Jake, and so have you. The old man wouldn't have made all them preparations for Cratchit to murder him, would he? It don't hang together. The gun was right beside him when Ambrosch found him." "Cratchit could have put it there, couldn't he?" Jake demanded. Grandmother broke in excitedly. "See here, Jake Marpole, don't you go trying to add murder to suicide. We're deep enough in trouble. Otto reads you too many of them detective stories." "It will be easy to decide all that, Emmeline," said grandfather quietly. "If he shot himself in the way they think, the gash will be torn from the inside outward." "Just so it is, Mr. Burden," Otto affirmed. "I seen bunches of hair and stuff sticking to the poles and straw along the roof. They was blown up there by gunshot, no question." Grandmother told grandfather she meant to go over to the Shimerdas with him. "There is nothing you can do," he said doubtfully. "The body can't be touched until we get the coroner here from Black Hawk, and that will be a matter of several days this weather." "Well, I can take them some victuals anyway, and say a word of comfort to them poor little girls." The oldest one was his darling, and was like a right hand to him. He might have thought of her, he's left her alone in a hard world. She glanced distrustfully at Ambrosch, who was now eating his breakfast at the kitchen table. Fuchs, although he had been up in the cold nearly all night, was going to make the long ride to Black Hawk to fetch the priest and the coroner. On the grey gelding, our best horse, he would try to pick his way across the country, with no roads to guide him. "Don't you worry about me, Mrs. Burden," he said cheerfully. as he put on a second pair of socks. "I've got a good nose for directions, and I never did need much sleep. It's the gray I'm worried about. I'll save him what I can, but it'll strain him, as sure as I'm telling you." "This is no time to be over considerate of animals, Otto. Do the best you can for yourself. Stop at the Widow Stephens for dinner. She's a good woman, and she'll do well by you." After Fuchs rode away, I was left with Ambrosch. I saw a side of him I had not seen before. He was deeply, even slavishly devout. He did not say a word all morning, but sat with his rosary in his hands, praying, now silently, now aloud. He never looked away from his beads, nor lifted his hands except to cross himself. Several times the poor boy fell asleep where he sat, wakened with a start, and began to pray again. No wagon could be got to the Shimerdas until a road was broken, and that would be a day's job. Grandfather came from the barn on one of our big black horses, and Jake lifted grandmother up behind him. She wore her black hood and was bundled up in shawls. Grandfather tucked his bushy white beard inside his overcoat. They looked very biblical as they set off, I thought. Jake and Ambrosch followed them, riding the other black and my pony, carrying bundles of clothes that we had got together for Mrs. Shimerda. I watched them go past the pond and over the hill by the drifted cornfield. Then, for the first time, I realized that I was alone in the house. I felt a considerable extension of power and authority, and was anxious to acquit myself creditably. I carried in cobs and wood from the long cellar and filled both the stoves. I remembered that in the hurry and excitement of the morning nobody had thought of the chickens, and the eggs had not been gathered. Going out through the tunnel, I gave the hens their corn, emptied the ice from their drinking pan, and filled it with water. After the cat had had his milk, I could think of nothing else to do, and I sat down to get warm. The quiet was delightful, and the ticking clock was the most pleasant of companions. I got Robinson Crusoe and tried to read, but his life on the island seemed dull compared with ours. Presently, as I looked with satisfaction about our comfortable sitting-room, it flashed upon me that if Mr. Shimerda's soul were lingering about in this world at all, it would be here in our house, which had been more to his liking than any other in the neighborhood. I remembered his contented face when he was with us on Christmas Day. If he could have lived with us, this terrible thing would never have happened. I knew it was homesickness that had killed Mr. Shimerda, and I wondered whether his released spirit would not eventually find its way back to his own country. I thought of how far it was to Chicago, and then to Virginia, to Baltimore, and then the great wintry ocean. No, he would not at once set out upon that long journey. Surely his exhausted spirit, so tired of cold and crowding and the struggle with the ever-falling snow, was resting now in this quiet house. I was not frightened, but I made no noise. I did not wish to disturb him. I went softly down to the kitchen, which, tucked away so snugly underground, always seemed to me the heart and center of the house. There on the bench behind the stove I thought and thought about Mr. Shimerda. Outside I could hear the wind singing over hundreds of miles of snow. It was as if I had let the old man in out of the tormenting winter, and were sitting there with him. I went over all that Antonia had ever told me about his life before he came to this country, how he used to play the fiddle at weddings and dances. I thought about the friends he had mourned to leave, the trombone player, the great forest full of game, belonging, as Antonia said, to the nobles, from which she and her mother used to steal wood on moonlight nights. There was a white hart that lived in that forest, and if anyone killed it, he would be hanged, she said. Such vivid pictures came to me that they might have been Mr. Shimerda's memories, not yet faded out from the air in which they had haunted him. It had begun to grow dark when my household returned, and grandmother was so tired that she went at once to bed. Jake and I got supper, and while we were washing the dishes he told me in loud whispers about the state of things at the Shimerdas. Nobody could touch the body until the coroner came. If any one did, something terrible would happen, apparently. The dead man was frozen through, just as stiff as a dressed turkey you hang out to freeze, Jake said. The horses and oxen would not go into the barn until he was frozen so hard that there was no longer any smell of blood. They were stabled there now with the dead man because there was no other place to keep them. A lighted lantern was kept hanging over Mr. Shimerda's head. Ántonia and Ambrosch and the mother took turns going down to pray beside him. The crazy boy went with them because he did not feel the cold. I believed he felt cold as much as anyone else, but he liked to be thought insensible to it. He was always coveting distinction, poor Marek. Ambrosch, Jake said, showed more human feeling than he would have supposed him capable of, but he was chiefly concerned about getting a priest and about his father's soul, which he believed was in a place of torment and would remain there until his family and the priest had prayed a great deal for him. As I understand it, Jake concluded, it will be a matter of years to pray his soul out of purgatory, and right now he's in torment. I don't believe it, I said stoutly. I almost know it ain't true. I did not, of course, say that I believed he had been in that very kitchen all afternoon, on his way back to his own country. Nevertheless, after I went to bed, this idea of punishment and purgatory came back on me crushingly. I remembered the account of Dives and torment and shuddered. But Mr. Shimerda had not been rich and selfish. He had only been so unhappy that he could not live any longer. End of chapter 14.
Book 1, Chapter 15 of my Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephanie Dupal de Martin. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 1, The Shimerdas, Chapter 15. Otto Fuchs got back from Black Hawk at noon the next day. He reported that the coroner would reach the Shimerdas sometime that afternoon, but the missionary priest was at the other end of his parish, 100 miles away, and the trains were not running. Fuchs had got a few hours' sleep at the livery barn in town, but he was afraid the grey gelding had strained himself. Indeed, he was never the same horse afterward. That long trip through the deep snow had taken all the endurance out of him. Fuchs brought home with him a stranger, a young Bohemian who had taken a homestead near Black Hawk, and who came on his only horse to help his fellow countrymen in their trouble. That was the first time I ever saw Anton Jelinek. He was a strapping young fellow in the early 20s then, handsome, warm-hearted, and full of life, and he came to us like a miracle in the midst of that grim business. I remember exactly how he strode into our kitchen in his felt boots and long wolfskin coat, his eyes and cheeks bright with the cold. At sight of grandmother, he snatched off his fur cap, greeting her in a deep, rolling voice which seemed older than he. "I want to thank you very much, Mrs. Burden, for that you are so kind to poor strangers from my country." He did not hesitate like a farmer boy, but looked one eagerly in the eye when he spoke. Everything about him was warm and spontaneous. He said he would have come to see the Shimerdas before, but he had hired out to husk corn all the fall, and since winter began he had been going to the school by the mill to learn English along with the little children. He told me he had a nice lady teacher and that he liked to go to school. At dinner grandfather talked to Jelinek more than he usually did to strangers. "Will they be much disappointed because we cannot get a priest?" he asked. Jelinek looked serious. "Yes, sir, that is very bad for them. Their father has done a great sin." He looked straight at grandfather. "Our Lord has said that." Grandfather seemed to like his frankness. "We believe that too, Jelinek, but we believe that Mr. Shimerda's soul will come to its Creator as well off without a priest. We believe that Christ is our only intercessor." The young man shook his head. "I know how you think. My teacher at the school has explained, but I have seen too much. I believe in prayer for the dead. I have seen too much." We asked him what he meant. He glanced round the table. "You want I shall tell you? When I was a little boy like this one, I began to help the priest at the altar. I made my first communion very young. What the church teach seemed plain to me. By and by war times come, when the Austrians fight us. We have very many soldiers in camp near my village, and the cholera break out in that camp, and the men die like flies. All day long our priests go about there to give the sacrament to dying men, and I go with him to carry the vessels with the holy sacrament. Everybody that go near that camp catch the sickness but me and the priest. But we have no sickness, we have no fear, because we carry that blood and that body of Christ, and it preserve us." He paused, looking at grandfather. "That I know, Mr. Burden, for it happened to myself. All the soldiers know, too. When we walk along the road, the old priest and me, we meet all the time soldiers marching and officers on horse. All those officers, when they see what I carry under the cloth, I pull up their horses and kneel down on the ground in the road until we pass. So I feel very bad for my countryman to die without the sacrament, and to die in a bad way for his soul, and I feel sad for his family." We had listened attentively. It was impossible not to admire his frank, manly faith. "I'm always glad to meet a young man who thinks seriously about these things," said grandfather, "and I would never be the one to say you were not in God's care when you were among the soldiers." After dinner, it was decided that young Jelinek should hook our 2 strong black farm horses to the scraper and break a road through to the Shimerdas, so that a wagon could go when it was necessary. Fuchs, who was the only cabinet maker in the neighborhood, was set to work on a coffin. Jelinek put on his long wolfskin coat, and when we admired it, he told us that he had shot and skinned the coyotes, and the young man who batched with him, Jan Buska, who had been a fur worker in Vienna, made the coat. From the windmill I watched Jelinek come out of the barn with the blacks, and work his way up the hillside toward the cornfield. Sometimes he was completely hidden by the clouds of snow that rose about him. Then he and the horse would emerge black and shining. Our heavy carpenter's bench had to be brought from the barn and carried down into the kitchen. Fuchs selected boards from a pile of planks grandfather had hauled out from town in the fall to make a new floor for the oats bin. When at last the lumber and tools were assembled, and the doors were closed again and the cold drafts shut out, grandfather rode away to meet the coroner at the Shimerdas, and Fuchs took out his coat and settled down to work. I sat on his work table and watched him. He did not touch his tools at first, but figured for a long while on a piece of paper, and measured the planks and made marks on them. While he was thus engaged, he whistled softly to himself, or teasingly pulled at his half ear. Grandmother moved about quietly, so as not to disturb him. At last he folded his ruler and turned a cheerful face to us. "The hardest part of my job's done," he announced. "It's the head end of it that comes hard with me, especially when I'm out of practice. Last time I made one of these, Mrs. Burden," he continued, as he sorted and tried his chisels, "was for a fellow in the Black Tiger mine, up above Silverton, Colorado. The mouth of that mine goes right into the face of the cliff, and they used to put us in a bucket and run us over on a trolley and shoot us into the shaft. The bucket traveled across a box canyon 300 feet deep and about a third full of water. 2 Swedes that fell out of that bucket once and hit the water, feet down. If you'll believe it, they went to work the next day. Can't kill a Swede. But in my time a little Italian tried the high dive, and it turned out different with him. We was snowed in then, like we are now, and I happened to be the only man in camp that could make a coffin for him. It's a handy thing to know when you knock about like I've done." "We'd be hard put to it now, if you didn't know, Otto," grandmother said. "Yes'm," Fuchs admitted with modest pride. "So few folks does know how to make a good tight box that'll turn water. I sometimes wonder if there'll be anybody about to do it for me. However, I'm not at all particular that way." All afternoon, wherever one went in the house, one could hear the panting wheeze of the saw or the pleasant purring of the plane. They were such cheerful noises, seeming to promise new things for living people. It was a pity that those freshly planed pine boards were to be put underground so soon. The lumber was hard to work because it was full of frost, and the boards gave off a sweet smell of pine woods as the heap of yellow shavings grew higher and higher. I wonder why Fuchs had not stuck to cabinet work. He settled down to it with such ease and content. He handled the tools as if he liked to feel them, and when he planed, his hands went back and forth over the boards in an eager, beneficent way, as if he were blessing them. He broke out now and then into German hymns, as if this occupation brought back old times to him. At 4 o'clock Mr. Bushy, the postmaster, with another neighbor who lived east of us, stopped in to get warm. They were on their way to the Shimerdas. The news of what had happened over there had somehow got abroad through the snow-blocked country. Grandmother gave the visitors sugar cakes and hot coffee. Before these callers were gone, the brother of the widow Stevens, who lived on the Black Hawk Road, drew up at our door, and after him came the father of the German family, our nearest neighbors on the south. They dismounted and joined us in the dining room. They were all eager for any details about the suicide, and they were greatly concerned as to where Mr. Shimerda would be buried. The nearest Catholic cemetery was at Black Hawk, and it might be weeks before a wagon could get so far. Besides, Mr. Bushy and grandmother were sure that a man who had killed himself could not be buried in a Catholic graveyard. There was a burying ground over by the Norwegian church, west of Squaw Creek. Perhaps the Norwegians would take Mr. Shimerda in. After our visitors rode away in single file over the hill, we returned to the kitchen. Grandmother began to make the icing for a chocolate cake, and Otto again filled the house with the exciting, expectant song of the plane. One pleasant thing about this was that everybody talked more than usual. I had never heard the postmaster say anything but, "Only papers today," or "I've got a sack full of mail for you," until this afternoon. Grandmother always talked, dear woman, to herself or to the Lord, if there was no one else to listen. But grandfather was naturally taciturn, and Jake and Otto were often so tired after supper that I used to feel as if I were surrounded by a wall of silence. Now everyone seemed eager to talk. That afternoon Fuchs told me story after story, about the Black Tiger mine, and about violent deaths and casual buryings, and the queer fancies of dying men. You never really knew a man, he said, until you saw him die. Most men were game and went without a grudge. The postmaster, going home, stopped to say that grandfather would bring the coroner back with him to spend the night. The officers of the Norwegian church, he told us, had held a meeting and decided that the Norwegian graveyard could not extend its hospitality to Mr. Shimerda. Grandmother was indignant. "If these foreigners are so clannish, Mr. Bushy, we'll have to have an American graveyard that will be more liberal-minded. I'll get right after Josiah to start one in the spring. If anything was to happen to me, I don't want the Norwegians holding inquisitions over me to see whether I'm good enough to be laid amongst 'em." Soon grandfather returned, bringing with him Anton Jelinek and that important person, the coroner. He was a mild, flurried old man, a Civil War veteran, with one sleeve hanging empty. He seemed to find this case very perplexing, and said if it had not been for grandfather he would have sworn out a warrant against Krajiek. The way he acted and the way his axe fit the wound was enough to convict any man. Although it was perfectly clear that Mr. Shimerda had killed himself, Jake and the coroner thought something ought to be done to Krajiek because he behaved like a guilty man. He was badly frightened, certainly, and perhaps he even felt some stirrings of remorse for his indifference to the old man's misery and loneliness. At supper the men ate like Vikings, and the chocolate cake, which I had hoped would linger on until tomorrow in a mutilated condition, disappeared on the second round. They talked excitedly about where they should bury Mr. Shimerda. I gathered that the neighbors were all disturbed and shocked about something. It developed that Mrs. Shimerda and Ambrosch wanted the old man buried on the southwest corner of their own land. Indeed, under the very stake that marked the corner. Grandfather had explained to Ambrosch that some day, when the country was put under fence and the roads were confined to section lines, 2 roads would cross exactly on that corner. But Ambrosch only said, "It makes no matter." Grandfather asked Jelinek whether in the old country there was some superstition to the effect that a suicide must be buried at the crossroads. Jelinek said he didn't know. He seemed to remember hearing there had once been such a custom in Bohemia. "Mrs. Shimerda has made up her mind," he added. "I try to persuade her, and say it looks bad for her to all the neighbors, but she say so it must be. 'There I will bury him, if I dig the grave myself,' she say. I have to promise her I help Ambrosch make the grave tomorrow." Grandfather smoothed his beard and looked judicial. "I don't know whose wish should decide the matter, if not hers. But if she thinks she will live to see the people of this country ride over that old man's head, she is mistaken." End of chapter 15. Recording by Stephanie Dupal de Martin. Book 1, Chapter 16 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephanie Dupal de Martin. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 1, The Shimerdas, Chapter 16. Mr. Shimerda lay dead in the barn 4 days, and on the 5th they buried him. All day Friday, Jelinek was off with Ambrosch digging the grave, chopping out the frozen earth with old axes. On Saturday we breakfasted before daylight and got into the wagon with the coffin. Jake and Jelinek went ahead on horseback to cut the body loose from the pool of blood in which it was frozen fast to the ground. When grandmother and I went to the Shimerdas' house, we found the women folk alone. Ambrosch and Marek were at the barn. Mrs. Shimerda sat crouching by the stove. Antonia was washing dishes. When she saw me, she ran out of her dark corner and threw her arms around me. "Oh, Jimmy," she sobbed, "what do you think for my lovely papa?" It seemed to me that I could feel her heart breaking as she clung to me. Mrs. Shimerda, sitting on the stump by the stove, kept looking over her shoulder toward the door while the neighbors were arriving. They came on horseback, all except the postmaster, who brought his family in a wagon over the only broken wagon trail. The widow Stevens rode up from her farm 8 miles down the Black Hawk Road. The cold drove the women into the cave house, and it was soon crowded. A fine, sleety snow was beginning to fall, and everyone was afraid of another storm and anxious to have the burial over with. Grandfather and Jelinek came to tell Mrs. Shimerda that it was time to start. After bundling her mother up in clothes the neighbors had brought, Antonia put on an old cape from our house and the rabbit skin that our father had made for her. 4 men carried Mr. Shimerda's box up the hill. Krajiek slung along behind them. The coffin was too wide for the door, so it was put down on the slope outside. I slipped out from the cave and looked at Mr. Shimerda. He was lying on his side, with his knees drawn up. His body was draped in a black shawl, and his head was bandaged in white muslin, like a mummy's. One of his long, shapely hands lay out on the black cloth. That was all one could see of him. Mrs. Shimerda came out and placed an open prayer book against the body, making the sign of the cross on the bandaged head with her fingers. Ambrosch knelt down and made the same gesture, and after him Antonia and Marek. Yulka hung back. Her mother pushed her forward and kept saying something to her over and over. Yulka knelt down, shut her eyes, and put out her hand a little way, but she drew it back and began to cry wildly. She was afraid to touch the bandage. Mrs. Shimerda caught her by the shoulders and pushed her toward the coffin, but grandmother interfered. "No, Mrs. Shimerda," she said firmly. "I won't stand by and see that child frightened into spasms. She is too little to understand what you want of her. Let her alone." At a look from grandfather, Fuchs and Jelinek placed the lid on the box and began to nail it down over Mr. Shimerda. I was afraid to look at Antonia. She put her arms round Yulka and held the little girl close to her. The coffin was put into the wagon. We drove slowly away against the fine, icy snow which cut our faces like a sandblast. When we reached the grave, it looked a very little spot in that snow-covered waste. The men took the coffin to the edge of the hole and lowered it with ropes. We stood about watching them, and the powdery snow lay without melting on the caps and shoulders of the men and the shawls of the women. Jelinek spoke in a persuasive tone to Mrs. Shimerda, and then turned to grandfather. "She says, Mr. Burden, she is very glad if you can make some prayer for him here in English, for the neighbors to understand." Grandmother looked anxiously at grandfather. He took off his hat, and the other men did likewise. I thought his prayer remarkable. I still remember it. He began, "O great and just God, no man among us knows what the sleeper knows, nor is it for us to judge what lies between him and thee." He prayed that if any man there had been remiss toward the stranger come from a far country, God would forgive him and soften his heart. He recalled the promises to the widow and the fatherless, and asked God to smooth the way before this widow and her children, and to incline the hearts of men to deal justly with her. In closing, he said we were leaving Mr. Shimerda at thy judgment seat, which is also thy mercy seat. All the time he was praying, grandmother watched him through the black fingers of her glove, and when he said "Amen," I thought she looked satisfied with him. She turned to Otto and whispered, "Can't you start a hymn, Fuchs? It would seem less heathenish." Fuchs glanced about to see if there was general approval of her suggestion, then began, "Jesus, lover of my soul," and all the men and women took it up after him. Whenever I have heard the hymn since, it has made me remember that white waste and the little group of people, and the bluish air full of fine eddying snow, like long veils flying, while the nearer waters roll, while the tempest still is high. Years afterward, when the open grazing days were over, and the red grass had been ploughed under and under until it had almost disappeared from the prairie, when all the fields were under fence, and the roads no longer ran about like wild things, but followed the surveyed section lines, Mr. Shimerda's grave was still there, with a sagging wire fence around it, and an unpainted wooden cross. As grandfather had predicted, Mrs. Shimerda never saw the roads going over his head. The road from the north curved a little to the east just there, and the road from the west swung out a little to the south, so that the grave, with its tall red grass that was never mowed, was like a little island, and at twilight, under a new moon or the clear evening star, the dusty roads used to look like soft grey rivers flowing past it. I never came upon the place without emotion, and in all that country it was a spot most dear to me. I loved the dim superstition, the propitiatory intent that had put the grave there, and still more I loved the spirit that could not carry out the sentence, the air of the surveyed lines, the clemency of the soft earth roads, along which the homecoming wagons rattled after sunset. Never a tired driver passed the wooden cross, I am sure, without wishing well to the sleeper. End of chapter 16. Recording by Stephanie Dupal de Martin. Book 1, Chapter 17 of My Antonia. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephanie Dupal de Martin. My Antonia by Willa Cather. Book 1, The Shimerdas, Chapter 17. When spring came after that hard winter, one could not get enough of the nimble air. Every morning I wakened with a fresh consciousness that winter was over. There were none of the signs of spring for which I used to watch in Virginia, no budding woods or blooming gardens. There was only spring itself, the throb of it, the light restlessness, the vital essence of it everywhere, in the sky, in the swift clouds, in the pale sunshine, in the warm high wind, rising suddenly, sinking suddenly, impulsive and playful like a big puppy that pawed you and then lay down to be petted. If I had been tossed down blindfold on that red prairie, I should have known that it was spring. Everywhere now there was the smell of burning grass. Our neighbors burnt off their pasture before the new grass made a start, so that the fresh growth would not be mixed with the dead stand of last year. Those light, swift fires running about the country seemed a part of the same kindling that was in the air. The Shimerdas were in their new log house by then. The neighbors had helped them to build it in March. It stood directly in front of their old cave, which they used as a cellar. The family were now fairly equipped to begin their struggle with the soil. They had 4 comfortable rooms to live in, a new windmill, bought on credit, a chicken house and poultry. Mrs. Shimerda had paid grandfather $10 for a milk cow, and was to give him 15 more as soon as they harvested their first crop. When I rode up to the Shimerdas one bright windy afternoon in April, Yulka ran out to meet me. It was to her now that I gave reading lessons. Antonia was busy with other things. I tied my pony and went into the kitchen where Mrs. Shimerda was baking bread, chewing poppy seeds as she worked. By this time she could speak enough English to ask me a great many questions about what our men were doing in the fields. She seemed to think that my elders withheld helpful information, and that from me she might get valuable secrets. On this occasion she asked me very craftily when grandfather expected to begin planting corn. I told her, adding that he thought we should have a dry spring, and that the corn would not be held back by too much rain, as it had been last year. She gave me a shrewd glance. "He not Jesus," she blustered. "He not know about the wet and the dry." I did not answer her. What was the use? As I sat waiting for the hour when Ambrosch and Antonia would return from the fields, I watched Mrs. Shimerda at her work. She took from the oven a coffee cake which she wanted to keep warm for supper, and wrapped it in a quilt stuffed with feathers. I have seen her put even a roast goose in this quilt to keep it hot. When the neighbors were there building the new house, they saw her do this, and the story got abroad that the Shimerdas kept their food in their feather beds. When the sun was dropping low, Antonia came up the big south draw with her team. How much older she had grown in 8 months! She had come to us a child, and now she was a tall, strong young girl, although her 15th birthday had just slipped by. I ran out and met her as she brought her horses up to the windmill to water them. She wore the boots her father had so thoughtfully taken off before he shot himself, and his old fur cap. Her outgrown cotton dress switched about her calves, over the boot tops. She kept her sleeves rolled up all day, and her arms and throat were burned as brown as a sailor's. Her neck came up strongly out of her shoulders, like the bole of a tree out of the turf. One sees that draft horse neck among the peasant women in all old countries. She greeted me gaily, and began at once to tell me how much ploughing she had done that day. Ambrosch, she said, was on the north quarter, breaking sod with the oxen. "Jim, you ask Jake how much he ploughed today. I don't want that Jake get more done in one day than me. I want we have very much corn this fall." While the horses drew in the water and nosed each other, and then drank again, Antonia sat down on the windmill step and rested her head on her hand. "You see the big prayer fire from your place last night? I hope your grandpa ain't lose no stacks?" "No, we didn't. I came to ask you something, Tony. Grandmother wants to know if you can't go to the term of school that begins next week over at the sod schoolhouse. She says there's a good teacher, and you'd learn a lot." Antonia stood up, lifting and dropping her shoulders as if they were stiff. "I ain't got time to learn. I can walk like mans now. My mother can't say no more how Ambrosch do all and nobody to help him. I can work as much as him. School is all right for little boys. I help make this land one good farm." She clucked to her team and started for the barn. I walked beside her, feeling vexed. Was she going to grow up boastful like her mother, I wondered. Before we reached the stable, I felt something tense in her silence, and glancing up, I saw that she was crying. She turned her face from me and looked off at the red streak of dying light over the dark prairie. I climbed up into the loft and threw down the hay for her, while she unharnessed her team. We walked slowly back toward the house. Ambrosch had come in from the north quarter and was watering his oxen at the tank. Antonia took my hand. "Sometime you will tell me all those nice things you learn at the school, won't you, Jimmy?" she asked with a sudden rush of feeling in her voice. "My father, he went much to school. He know a great deal how to make the fine cloth like what you not got here. Play horn and violin, and he read so many books that the priest in Bohemian came to talk to him. You won't forget my father, Jim?" "No," I said. "I will never forget him." Mrs. Shimerda asked me to stay for supper. After Ambrosch and Antonia had washed the field dust from their hands and faces at the wash basin by the kitchen door, we sat down at the oilcloth-covered table. Mrs. Shimerda ladled meal mush out of an iron pot and poured milk on it. After the mush we had fresh bread and sorghum molasses, and coffee with the cake that had been kept warm in the feathers. Antonia and Ambrosch were talking in Bohemian, disputing about which of them had done more ploughing that day. Mrs. Shimerda egged them on, chuckling while she gobbled her food. Presently Ambrosch said suddenly in English, "You take them ox tomorrow and try the sod plough. Then you not be so smart." His sister laughed. "Don't be mad. I know it's awful hard work for break sod. I milk the cow for you tomorrow if you want." Mrs. Shimerda turned quickly to me. "That cow not give so much milk like what your grandpa say. If he make talk about $15, I'd send him back the cow." "He doesn't talk about the $15, I exclaimed indignantly. "He doesn't find fault with people." "He say I break his saw when we build, and I never," grumbled Ambrosch. I knew he had broken the saw, and then hid it and lied about it. I began to wish I had not stayed for supper. Everything was disagreeable to me. Antonia ate so noisily now, like a man, and she yawned often at the table and kept stretching her arms over her head as if they ached. Grandmother had said, "Heavy field work'll spoil that girl. She'll lose all her nice ways and get rough ones." She had lost them already. After supper I rode home through the sad, soft spring twilight. Since winter I had seen very little of Antonia. She was out in the fields from sun-up until sundown. If I rode over to see her where she was ploughing, she stopped at the end of a row to chat for a moment, then gripped her plough handles, clucked to her team, and waded on down the furrow, making me feel that she was now grown up and had no time for me. On Sundays she helped her mother make garden or sewed all day. Grandfather was pleased with Antonia. When he complained of her, he only smiled and said, "She will help some fellow get ahead in the world." Nowadays Tony could talk of nothing but the prices of things, or how much she could lift and endure. She was too proud of her strength. I knew too that Ambrosch put upon her some chores a girl ought not to do, and that the farm hands around the country joked in a nasty way about it. Whenever I saw her come up the furrow, shouting to her beasts, sunburned, sweaty, her dress open at the neck, and her throat and chest dust-splattered, I used to think of a tone in which poor Mr. Shimerda, who could say so little, yet managed to say so much when he exclaimed, "My Antonia!" End of chapter 17. Recording by Stephanie Dupal de Martin.